Aloha, friends and family, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Body and Soul Wisdom Podcast. I have with me today a beautiful, beautiful lady I am super excited to share with you this week. She is the podcast host of Java with Jen, Hearing God's Voice in Everyday Life. Thank you, Jenilee Samuel, for being with us today. How are you?
Absolutely. I'm doing so great. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to get to share with your audience.
I'm so excited to have you here today. Just before the show, we were sharing about what we love about podcasting. And I know you and I are both approaching season 5 of our podcast season. So congratulations to you.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. And we were just sharing about the joys of podcasting, what it's given us, how it's allowed us to spread our message and connect with amazing people. And for both you and I, it's been a huge part of our life. And so I'm really excited to have you on the show to share your experience and also to share what podcasting has done for you, what it has meant for you, how it has allowed you to share your values and amplify them in the world through hearing God's voice, but also you're in a place of mentoring other people to start their podcasts. So we have an exciting show lined up today.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about how you started, how you got into podcasting.
Yeah, so I am vocationally, my husband and I are pastors, and there's something unusual about the pastor's wife world is that we kind of fall what I call into this space called the gray zone, where it's kind of like we're seen as a team in ministry, but many pastors' wives aren't actually employed by their churches. They don't necessarily have an actual pastoral position. They're kind of assumed but in a lot of regards, but there's a lot of gray areas that we fall into where it can feel like we don't really know what our place is. We want to serve a purpose, but we either don't have we don't feel like acknowledged for our gifts or whatever. And so not all women probably fall in that place. Different denominations approach it differently. But there's just a lot of traditional gender roles associated in the church still. And so when I was single and young, and I grew up in Arizona, and I've been in ministry since I was young. At 14, I knew I wanted to do ministry as an individual, despite the fact that I had grown up as a missionary kid. And so from 14 to 21, I had all these incredible opportunities to teach the word and minister to people and use my voice and feel like I was using my gifts. But then this weird thing happened when I got married and moved to Southeast Texas. Suddenly I became kind of invisible, and my husband was acknowledged as a pastor. So even when I would introduce myself to people and they'd be like, "Oh, what do you and your husband do?" And I'd be like, "Oh, we're pastors." And they're like, "Your husband is a pastor?" And I was like, "No, we are pastors," And so there was always this like sense of being overlooked. And I, to this day, after 18 years of ministry, still have not had the opportunity to preach on a Sunday morning, despite that I've had a globally ranked podcast and I've preached outside of our church, but never been given the opportunity to preach inside of our church. We've never been the senior pastors. We've always been like second in command kind of thing. And so for many, many years, that caused me a lot of pain because I grew up, thankfully, in a very supportive environment where my leaders recognized my communication gifts and my calling to teach the word. And so they gave me those opportunities and nurtured that. So when this shift happened, I was very unprepared. I didn't understand that it was cultural and that my husband was learning how to pull me in and how to put my gifts to use in different things. And so after a number of months, actually a number of years of crying and struggling and feeling invisible, and then a few months of believing the lie that people or culture could actually restrict my ability to fulfill the call of God on my life, I finally broke up with that thought and that belief and realized at the end of my life, I'm going to stand before the Lord by myself. There will be nobody I can blame. There will be no excuses I can give. The Lord's going to ask me what I did with my gifts and if I stewarded them and if I multiplied them into people. And so I said, you know what, then I'm going to find a way. And so I kind of looked at what tools were around. and realized YouTubing was kind of intimidating. I didn't want to have to be camera ready every time. And I didn't want to mess with lighting and recording and editing. And so I was like, podcasting seems pretty simple. Let's do podcasting. And so I just decided to do a podcast. It seemed very unintimidating, and it's simple in theory, but it surprised me how many things I had to learn to be able to do what I was doing well. And so after a few years of struggling, I finally learned all the skills that I needed. And so now I finally have a successful podcast, and people have seen that. And so I've had people start coming to me, asking me to teach them how to start a podcast. And that's kind of where my mastermind grew out of a desire to help as many people as possible and help them shortcut all the frustration and the learning curve that I experienced.
Wow, so much good stuff to unpack there. Thank you for sharing that. One of the topics that I love to speak about is shifting the paradigm of feminine leadership. And so I love how you shared that story. And I didn't even know all like the depth of that story until you shared that. But I love that I just got to witness how you, in your personal journey, looked at what the cultural norms were and how you felt invisible, and yet you found a way to, in today's world, still show up in ministry, in leadership, in your own way to share your voice and values in the world through podcasting. It's so awesome. That I love that you shared that. What would you say? So you're going into season 5.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Super, super awesome. What would you tell somebody? Well, actually, I want to back up. What has been your favorite part about this journey? Because to make it to 5 years and to have the struggles of the first couple of years, and you and I both know, like this in the very beginning, it can feel like a labor of love, which is I'm sure that's why you love to mentor people into starting their podcast, because 5 years ago, there weren't, at least for me, I couldn't find those resources to really help me. I had somebody to produce the show, but I didn't necessarily have somebody to coach me on using my voice and getting, growing the podcast and the sort of the next level of keeping it going. So to be here 5 years from now, when you look back, what has been your favorite parts about podcasting?
I think my favorite part is that the world feels so small in a great way. Like, I have met people, I've had people on my show from Australia and New Zealand and Europe, and I just met them in a Facebook group. And then we get on a call and we're sharing our lives and our stories. And it's so beautiful to me how every single human has a story. I just made a reel about it on my Instagram. Like, everyone has a story. I could go grab someone off the street and bring them on my show, and asking the right questions, you can find gold in their story. And that is one of the most beautiful things to me. So I feel like doing my podcast, I always say, like, it feeds me as much as it feeds my listeners. And I feel like so many times I'll have someone, especially who's faith-based and brings the word, and I'm like getting a spanking over here asking these questions. I'm like, oh, I'm getting convicted. I need to repent after the show is over, And so to me, it's just so beautiful. The world becomes so small. People are just so beautiful and colorful. And I just love getting invited into those spaces with them.
Yeah, I would have to agree on that. One of my favorite things is the connections that we get to make, that the world feels so small, and that we create this space for really authentic, vulnerable, raw, real conversations, because we are in today's world, we are just, I feel like we're just, like, media and negativity, like it's just being thrown at us constantly. And it's really nice to hear the like real conversations and voices of people to bring us kind of back down to earth, grounded into this experience, and just remember who we really are and what we're really here for, versus what's happening, in the media, social media and television world. It can feel like a very lonely and confusing place sometimes out in the world. What would you say over the years were some of the biggest challenges that you overcame throughout your podcasting career?
Oh, by far, learning all the things. Like, I didn't know what an RSS feed was. When I started a podcast and signed up with Apple Podcasts, it took them 6 weeks to even approve. Because back when I started, I'm kind of an OG podcaster, right? It's like, it's only been 5 years and podcasting has been around longer than that, but it's grown so much in the last 5 years that when I started, it still was such a small little community. And so I registered with Apple Podcasts and they're like, put your RSS. I'm like, what the heck is an RSS feed? So from that to even like learning the formatting of interviewing and how to schedule people in an automated way, to creating graphics and setting up landing pages and what's an email list and how do I build an email list, and like all the aspects that go with podcasting to create a business out of it. I told my husband, I was like, I feel like I've earned 2 college degrees in the last 5 years, just learning about marketing and copywriting and podcasting and editing and all the things. And so I'm actually really proud of how much I've learned in the last 5 years.
So when we talk about podcasting, there's so many different levels of podcasting. There's the person who wants to have the open conversation and just share their thoughts and record them and see what lands for people. There's the people who want to create a platform to share a message, for conscious conversations around something. For mine, it happens to be the different elements of well-being. For yours, it's living life, daily life through the voice of God. We all have like our platform and our messaging that we're using. And then there's probably more levels, several levels above that, where people are actually, I have friends that are making a very healthy income off of podcasting, and there's sponsorships, there's it can grow so far. And I think sometimes when people are getting started, it can feel a little bit intimidating. What would you say to the person who is, because I know my audience is mostly women, but I also get some men that are either leaders, executives, or entrepreneurs. And some of them choose to start a show because maybe down the line, I'm thinking of one of my clients in particular who eventually wants to own a bookstore. So she wants to start a podcast that does book reviews, which is like fabulous, right? Because it's like, you're either going to get the book review from a reliable source, or you're going to go read the back of books. And so what a great little niche to start a podcast. She's an executive. And then I have other people I know in my audience who are entrepreneurs that really want to allow the podcast platform to be their marketing tool, or rather than Facebook ads, or, something like that. So what would you say to the person right now who's listening? Because it could be either one of those people who's thinking, I really want to start a podcast. I don't even know where to start. I don't know if I want to grow and monetize. Do I have to do that? What would you say to that person who is thinking about getting started on what they might need to hear to just take that next step?
I heard one business coach say to me, anything that you need to learn is within 2 hours of online study. Like, you can learn anything. That doesn't mean you'll master it, but it means you can learn enough to do a thing within 2 hours. Now, because there are so many aspects, if you want to do it well, there's a lot of things to learn. Now, you can go real basic, and I teach my students, I'm like, listen, just get the basics in. You can dress it up later. Like, let's start with the basics, because you've got to start with the basics regardless. And so I teach my students, like, let's work smarter, not harder. Let's keep it streamlined, master the streamlined version, and then your audience will grow with you. And so I do teach my students how to build it into their busy lifestyles. I have one student who works 70 to 90 hours a week, and he's crushing it. He's doing amazing. And so, but I would say, like, I can help you save your sanity if you're wanting to learn to podcast, because like one of my other students was like, Jenilee, I work full time and I have 3 kids. If I had to figure all this out on my own, I never, ever would have figured it out. I would not have a podcast right now. She's like, I'm so grateful for your masterclass, because I spread it over 10 weeks. And so it's just one important aspect of podcasting per week. So by week 5, their podcast is actually live. And then the last 5 weeks is how to grow and monetize and scale. And so, but with that, I would say, for business, podcasting is huge. That's actually what's causing podcasting to really gain some momentum, is that business people are starting to realize podcasting is such a great way to build trust with your audience, to position yourself as an expert in your field, to add value to your audience. And so it's a really great way to nurture the relationship with your audience without it being inauthentic or without it sounding or feeling gimmicky. And so that podcasting is just really great for business. And then of course it's great for people who just have a message they want to get into the world. It's more of a passion project. And you're right, when you said the first few years feel like just a labor of love, that is absolutely what it felt like. I remember crying many days. I go look at my downloads and I'd be like, 11 people listened. What am I doing with my life? And I would just be so upset. And then I realized, like, I won't go the distance if I'm not staying focused on what my why is. And so I just had to keep reminding myself, I have to be driven not by the numbers. Numbers come and go. I have to be driven by the why. And if your why is to serve your people and whatever problem that you're solving, then you will stay obsessed with the purpose and you'll be able to remain consistent for the long run. And then of course that will pay off and will eventually bear fruit. And so, yeah, it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it's super important to really know what your why is behind the podcast. And
Yeah.
what's really coming through for me is that it's the platform of the podcast is so much bigger than you. So you don't really realize the reach that you're getting through your messaging. It's a great way for somebody who's heard you to introduce somebody to you, to say, hey, like, check this person out, listen to this podcast. And sometimes it only takes one episode. Like sometimes one episode can literally change somebody's life. I've had people send me those messages before. And it's funny because you never really know which one that's going to be.
Yeah.
Then you'll notice like some podcast episodes will be downloaded quite a bit more than other ones. And you don't know if it's the topic that you chose, the tagline that you chose, or what it was. But those moments, to the person who's thinking of starting a podcast, the moments where you receive those messages, and in my experience, it is a lot smaller than the number of reach that you're actually getting. So I guess what's coming through is trust the process, that your word is getting out there, that people are listening, and that it's making a bigger impact than you realize. I think especially in the beginning, because as you were sharing, 11 downloads, but eventually I'm sure you would go back, and that whatever episode that was, the number of downloads on that particular episode has probably increased, because you can always go back and listen to episodes. But it's like, I always think of like, you don't build a big house on a rocky foundation. So you start with a solid foundation and you just keep taking the steps and you move forward and you trust. And on a personal note, there is a part of that that takes resiliency and trust and consistency, which is why it's so great to have support. Because as you're starting, I think in the culture that we live in, we expect rapid results. And podcasting, as you said, is one of those opportunities to build trust, to build an audience, to get your message out there. What we're really doing, what you've done, is we're building a like-minded community. And we're building a sacred container of conversations and trust of like-minded people that we just get to share. And sometimes change happens in the life of those people just because of something that you said that day. It came on the perfect day and they needed to hear it. And I also know, and I reflect back to when I got started, because now I actually started my first podcast in 2015. So this is how I know that it's so important to have support, because I started in 2015. And what I did differently in 2019, when I started the second time, is one, I hired a producer to do, like, I would just talk and he would finish the work for me. But also one of the things that helped me, and I'm curious if you would just be willing to share a couple of like wisdom nuggets or like tricks and tips that have helped you, but batch recording was something that was really helpful for me, because I wanted to be consistent in doing a weekly podcast. So when I started the first time, like, I mean, my kids were quite a bit younger too. We're talking like maybe 6 and 9 or 7 and 10. So I remember just being like, oh, it's Thursday, I'm supposed to record. And like my kid was sick. And I was like, well, I missed that Thursday. And then just like working out, you get out of the habit and then
Yeah.
hard to get back in. So I finally learned, okay, now Thursdays, when I'm getting in that creative flow, sometimes it's also the day that I have guest speakers. Sometimes I'll record 3 or 4 episodes so that I have them for the coming month. That has been one of my tricks. What are some of yours that have helped you to continue staying consistent? Because life happens. So you're a mom, you have all of these roles that we're juggling. How have you stayed consistent in your podcast? What has kept you going?
When the Lord actually is who prompted me to start doing weekly episodes. When I started, it was monthly. And of course, my momentum was really slow. That's probably why I only had those 11 downloads. And so the Lord was the one who told me to do weekly episodes. And that really was a step of faith, because I was like, am I going to run out of content? Will I have enough time? And so I just kind of jumped out there. And I found that even on weeks when I was like at the deadline, my podcast is supposed to be live in 3 hours and I still had nothing recorded, the Lord would literally arrange these people to suddenly be available to record with me, or I would suddenly get a word out of the word, to like share on the show. And so the Lord has definitely been like a co-pilot with me, which has really helped. But practically speaking, I actually created in Canva these planners for myself to help keep me organized. So I have a few different pages, and I put these in the course for my students to utilize. I give them a template so they can customize it. But I've got like a quarterly planner, which really helps. I like to schedule at least a quarter out. Sometimes I'm on top of it and sometimes I'm not. But when I am, it helps so much, where I'll just kind of build in holidays and I'll try to work around what might be relevant at that time. And then, if there's anything really popular in the news, I'll try to keep that in mind. If there's, just hot topics are important to keep at the forefront. And then I also have the monthly, so then I can kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive and look at my month as a whole. And then I've got the episode planners, which are just kind of individual, so I can take notes when I'm interviewing people on calls and stuff. And it's been tremendously helpful. I went for the first 3 years without those planners, and I was racking my brain. I was like, I am so disorganized. I have to make a plan. So when I created those, they saved my life. And I noticed I actually was able to be planned out further in advance simply because I had a system of organization. And so those have been game changers. But batch recording is massively huge. Like, that's the best way to do it, because that's the only way to stay ahead.
Yeah, it is super helpful. It's a great tool. When you look back over 5 years of podcasting, and we talk about like, what is it that keeps us going? And there's definitely this element of faith. There's the, trusting, and that you're going to have the topic to talk about, and that the people are going to show up. And I'm wondering, is there also this sense, I know that this is true for me, of like looking back and recalling those favorite moments, either those messages that you received from somebody, or the person that you got to interview, or your favorite episode. And since I know some of my listeners might be new to your podcast, I'm going to invite them to listen to your podcast, Java with Jen. What would some of those favorite episodes for your listeners or guests that you had on the show, or that you were on, what comes to mind as like your top 3 over the past 5 years?
I would say there's actually quite a few that are some of my favorites, but the ones that I usually point people to that I get a lot of feedback from, because they're really very much at the core of my niche and my focus, is the episodes I've done where I teach people how to hear God's voice, and kind of I go through the biblical explanation of how does it work? What is this? Why are we listening for God's voice? How do you know if you're hearing God's voice or the enemy's voice or culture's voice or your voice, and how to filter those and how to develop that sensitivity in a safe, no risk way. And people love those episodes. I probably should take them and just kind of put it into a little course so people can just take it individually. But those are episodes 12 and 13, and then 37 through 40. And those are really my heart in some episodes. That's my favorite. But I think one that I remember that's one of my favorites is I think it's episode 8. It was way back in the beginning. And I have a group of intercessors that actually pray for my show. And I had messaged them and I said, hey guys, I've pretty much just kind of had people I know on the show, but it's in my heart. I really want to have a celebrity on the show. So can you pray that I'll connect with a celebrity somehow? And they're like, yeah, we're on it. So literally the next day, or maybe even later that day, I was on Instagram watching through the stories, and I follow this guy named Manuel Reyes, who, if you've seen Bon Qui Qui or the nail salon stint from Saturday Night Live with Angela Johnson. She's a comedian. She's hilarious. And he's her husband. And they both were in that movie, Mom's Night Out. And so in the movie Mom's Night Out, he was actually my favorite character because he was kind of airheady and hilarious. And so when I found out they were married, I started following them on social media. So he was posting in his stories, asking questions about podcasting, and the comments were open. So I was like, oh, I'll just answer some of his questions. So I was just responding and helping him out. And so we started a conversation. And so I gave him as much knowledge as I had. And then at the end, he's like, well, thanks so much. You've been super helpful. And I was like, hey, before I let you go, it's actually always been a dream of mine to have you and your wife on my podcast. Would you be interested? And he was like, well, I can't speak for my wife. She's really busy right now. He goes, but I'd be happy to. And I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so I was so excited. So he was my first, I didn't even know how to like interview over the phone yet. And so I was like, crap. I called my sister. I'm like, help me. I need to learn how to use this technology so I can act like I know what I'm doing. And so I sent him the information, and we had a great episode. It's still one of my more popular ones, probably because he's more famous than I am. And so that one's episode 8. If anyone's interested, we had a long, wonderful conversation. So that one's poignant to me just because that came as a result, literally, of prayer. So
that has probably been one of my favorite parts about podcasting as well. It's just that it just breaks down barriers and walls between people. It's just conversation that you wouldn't normally get to have with certain people. I've had some guests on the show as well. And then when you get into conversation, you realize like you're just two people having a conversation, and it's super awesome. I want to close the show by really highlighting who you are to the listeners so that they might, if they're thinking of starting a podcast, they want to speak their truth. They want a platform to own their voice, to share their values into the world. And maybe they're sitting with podcast is right for me. How do I know that Jenilee is going to be the right person to mentor me through that experience? Yes, she has 5 years of experience. She's learned a lot. You shared that your favorite episodes were really teaching people how to listen to the voice of God. So I just want to close with that because that's really who you are. That's what your podcast is about. And I'm wondering if you would just be willing to share where we are in the world today. There is so much noise, and I'm going to see where this conversation is going to take us, but there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of false light that is super confusing. And there's just media, right? Like, I mean, I think of raising children in today's world and how so many things can feel so confusing, even just in the words that are being thrown around and what is really real with social media. So if you could share with us, give some insight into your world, to your podcast, what you share, what you are a stand for in the world. How do you navigate day to day? What is the most important thing for you to share right now to these listeners on how you navigate day to day? What is the true voice of God that leads you every single day to know that you are on your right path? And I know that is a big question. And I want to point people who are interested to your podcast, but I also want to give people some insight into who you are so that if you're the right person to mentor them, they know that this is the way that they can connect with you. Because I know people are sitting in that right now. I know that there are people listening to this show that are confused. I know that there are people listening to the show who have felt hurt, and I know people that might even felt rejected or abandoned by God, or they don't know how to listen to what is true for them. So what could you say in this moment has been the guiding factor that has led you even to this podcast, because that's how you got to this podcast, that somebody might need to hear who's listening right now?
Yeah. I am a firm believer that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us. And the times in my life when I've lived like life was happening to me, like when I felt like people or culture could stand in my way of fulfilling God's call on my life, I have lived a small, purposeless, really sad life, you know? But when I finally embraced the fact that I can't control the world around me, I can't control what's happening in culture, I can't control how people choose to treat me or how they regard me. All I can control is what I bring into the world. And I believe very much the parable of the seed and the sower, or not the seed and the sower, sorry, the parable of the talents in the Bible. I believe that we all have a mandate. In that parable, there was three servants, and the master, who it's kind of an allegory of God and his people. And the master gave all three of them different amounts of money based on what their faith was, what their skill and what their faith was. And so all three of them had a choice what they were going to do with what was put in their hands. And same as us, you know, God's put gifts in us, and it's our choice what we do with them. And the two that chose to take risk and invest and multiply their talents were told that they were good and faithful servants. And he said, to whom little has been given, more will be entrusted. And he said, but to the other one that didn't multiply, he was afraid. And he took what was given him, and he said, the master's a hard master. And so he said, I'm going to go bury this so that at least I know I'll have it when he comes back and I can give it back to him. And the master was like, you fool, why didn't you at least invest it in the bank so I could get interest? And so there's something about being shrewd and being strategic and being intelligent and intentional with what God has put in our hands. And most people are like, oh, I don't have a message that's going to change the world. I don't have some big thing. And it's like, that matters nothing. What matters is, what are you going to do with what God has put in your hands? That is what you will give an account for, whether he's given you peanuts to work with or whether he's given you gold nuggets. Like, you have a responsibility to take what he's put in your hands and not just take risk with it, but multiply it. Because when you take risk, you will multiply it. And so I encourage those who are considering a podcast. Podcasting isn't for everybody. Not everybody is going to be like, yes, that's my vehicle. But if there's a spark in your heart and you're like, I feel like this could be something. I'm scared to death, but this could be something. I'm going to encourage you, take some risk, do it scared, because I was scared at first too, but nothing good comes out of our comfort zone, right? We don't stretch ourselves or grow into our potential in our comfort zone. What we grow when we get a little uncomfortable and we stretch ourselves. And so I feel like every life has a responsibility to take what's been put in their life and in their hand and multiply it into the world. And it's up to God, like the parable of the loaves and the fishes. That little boy had one little loaf and two little fishes that he offered to Jesus, and Jesus, partnering with his gift, multiplied it and fed it to the crowd. And so it's really about partnership with God. It's, I take a step of faith and I bring what's in my hands, and you bring your supernatural Godhead to that, and your anointing, the anointing of Jesus and his favor touching my gifts that are being offered, is what multiplies it and is what feeds the masses. So when I've been discouraged over my podcast and I feel like I don't have much to offer, I say, you know what, Lord, I'm bringing you my loaves and my fishes. Help me multiply it. And the Lord has been so faithful to bring me tools and people to learn how to do more with my show. And I believe the favor of the Lord is why it's a globally ranked show. And so all that to say, the pastoral heart in me does come out in my coaching, and I definitely believe in my students, and I am the loudest cheerleader for them, and I want to see them succeed. It feels like such a privilege and an honor to help them give birth to what's inside of them. So if that's you and you've been considering something like this, I just want to put it out there. Just get on a call with me and we can talk about it and see if it's a good fit for you, and maybe even help you hone what your messaging would be. I had one student who came in and she wasn't really going to sign up. She was like, I kind of would like to, but maybe later. And so I just started asking her some questions like, well, what would you say to people if you had a platform? And what message is in your heart that you'd really like to teach people? So I started asking her strategic questions, and she just all this stuff started coming out, and it blew her own mind. And she was like, after 30 minutes, she was like, oh my gosh, I need to start a podcast. It's amazing, you know? And so now she's one of my best students. I'm going to pull her on as a coach whenever we scale and I need more coaches because she's incredible. And so, but that's how it started, was just asking some questions, taking some risk, getting a little uncomfortable. And it's been just an amazing journey for her. So that's what I would say.
Wow. You definitely are in your gift when I asked you that question, you were just like, yep, that's your element. So thank you so much for sharing. I loved what you said and just painting that picture, going back to just allowing the voice of God to lead you. Like, it's really such, it's not up to us. We can't control everything. And we get to choose every day how we show up. We get to choose to trust. We get to choose to move forward, and that to see that there is support available to us, not just from God, but from other people, because I do believe that both of those help us to grow even more. So you have a course that is coming up again. Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about who that would be for.
Yes. And I do want to preface, my course is not just for people of the Christian faith. It's not a Christian program. I am a Christian, so that will probably come out in some of my language, but if you're willing to walk with me, even if we're different faiths, then you're welcome to. But it is a 10-week training program. And in essence, I built a program that I would have loved to have when I was in their place, when I was starting. I didn't have, like you said, I didn't really have coaches or resources in abundance to help. And so it's a 10-week program where it's bite size, so that each week they cover one area of podcasting. They complete the tasks for that week that are associated, and then they just build on it every week. So it's meant to be able to be built into their life. We cover everything from creating your podcast identity, the equipment that you'll need. And side note, I actually, aside from the cost of the course itself, you are going to have little to no expenses involved. Maybe a microphone, and maybe paying for your Canva membership. And other than that, I mean, that's under $200 right there, less than $200. And then the cost of the course, because I very much believe if you have a lot of overhead to keep your show running, you're not going to be able to maintain it for very long, because it'll kind of, the stress of the finances can burn you out. And so I'm of the smarter, not harder, and free or cheap. And that's how we go. So the apps and programs that I recommend are affordable or cheap, or affordable or free. And so then we cover branding and recording your intro, outro, choosing the music for your show that's going to help create the vibe of your personality of your show. I teach them about blogging and email marketing and social media and monetization, all the things that are needed to not just build a quality show, but to sustain and grow their quality show.
That's so important. And, one of the things that I love that you said, just knowing what I know about people who've started podcasting, is that there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. You can jump into it with someone who coaches you or mentors you and gives you kind of the full big picture. That's one of the roads. You can go to the road where you pay for production, like I did 5 years ago. And now I know that if you jump right into that, sometimes what people are charging for that is like $3,500 to $5,000 a month. So that can be a really high investment point where, yes, maybe you get a little bit higher quality voice recording, but I feel that if you're new to podcasting, getting into the game and learning how to build it, it's like becoming, before you can pay someone to do all the things, I think it's important to know like what all of that is, right?
Yeah.
So there's always going to be different choices, and having access to something that is a little bit more financially available, especially when you're first getting started, to see if you even are going to enjoy the long-term journey before you go all in. Because I'm speaking to the audience here and just who I know, because I have different levels of entrepreneurs and executives that have a different amount of financial resources available. And I love how you said, if you have a really large overhead, it could be easy to get burned out on it, because you're not receiving the fruits of your efforts. You're just putting it out there, and then you're putting more money into it and you're growing your audience. But if you're not monetizing it right away, but you're putting money into it, then it can start to feel a little bit draining. So that's true. A really that was a really great message there at the end, especially for those that, and I'm wondering, do you, for the person listening, is it just for the person getting started, or do you have different levels of mentorship for the people who are, maybe they've been doing a podcast for a while, but they're in a little bit of a stagnant place and they want to kind of take it to that next level? Do you offer private mentorship for those people, or what else is there anything, is it, who, do you have something available for the people who are not just getting started?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me that. So I had like three thoughts happening at the same time. First thing is, I spend about $20 a month to run my podcast. That's all. And I don't hire anybody. Nobody helps me with the production. So I teach my students how to do it very streamlined so that you don't have to hire people. Eventually I will, because that will be advantageous, but right now I don't. And so I teach my students how to keep it very streamlined. But for those who want to, so I have 3 tiers as far as the content of the programs are in essence the same, but there's 3 different delivery styles. One is a digital course, and that's the lower ticket offer. And that one is for people who are like, I just want to give me the videos, give me the workbook, let me do it on my own. So that's available for those people. And it does come with a Facebook group that is very active, very supportive and engaging with other students that are there. The second one, which is the one that launches in September, is my 10-week mastermind. And that is the one where it's the video, it's live videos, live training with me. And so that's once a week video calls. And then it's a 1 hour of coaching on whatever that topic is for the week. And then 30 minutes of Q&A. And it's a small group of students. And so there's a lot of it's high touch as far as my coaching with you. And then it comes with the Facebook group that is very active, where the students give each other encouragement and feedback. If they're working through artwork or a title or a subtitle or whatever, they all give each other a lot of feedback. It's wonderful. And then of course, it's 130-page workbook that we do a chapter at a time. It's built it myself. It's amazing, full of resources. And then you get 4 one-on-one coaching calls with me throughout the 10-week process. So that's a lot more one-on-one coaching than I've ever experienced with any coach I've ever hired. But I always want the one-on-one coaching, which is why I make that available. I never want my students to feel overwhelmed or stuck. And so that's why I build that into that program. So I charge way, way, way less than any other coach I've encountered for what I'm offering in this program. So it is actually very, very affordable. And then my highest package is actually a 2-day jumpstart, which is where I come to, we can do it virtually, or if they live close enough, then I come to that person. And in 2 days, I get them totally set up with their show. I'll do their headshots and create their artwork and do their brand kit. And then I teach them everything they need to run their show. I get the equipment pre-ordered, so it's there and we can set it up while I'm there with them. And so it's for those who are like, ain't nobody got time for 10 weeks. Let's get my show up. We get it up in 2 days. And then once people have come through my program, or say they're already a podcaster, and they're like, I'm already up, but I would like a community and I'd like more coaching, then they can join my podcast network, which is called Imagine Media Podcast Network. I created it because my students who were graduating were not ready to leave the fold. And they were like, can we keep coaching with you? And so that one is, it's lower intensity. So it's just once a month coaching. And we dive deeper into those topics that'll help them monetize or grow, scale, collaborate with each other, stuff like that. And so that is available. That's a very low price point. It's $99 a year or $12 a month. So it's very, very affordable because it's a brand new network. So those are the options that I have available. And anyone is welcome to be a part of the network if they already have a show.
Oh, super awesome. I'll have to check that out. Thank you so much for being on the show. And we are certainly going to drop the link I know you sent over to me to sign up for that course. You've been generous enough to offer my listeners a gift offering of a discount to join the show. So I'm super excited. I think it's my name. It's going to be Jen Mons. Right?
Yes. And that's for $200 off of the mastermind or the 2-day package. Yes. And so that's an offer just for your listeners who heard me on this show.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure to anyone who's listening, who is ready to own their voice and share their values in the world and feels like podcasting is the platform to do it, I would invite you to check out Jenilee's offering in her upcoming mastermind, which starts in September. And also thank you for just sharing who you are and how you your about your podcast and how you allow the voice of God to lead you through your life. Thank you for just sharing, what came through for you as far as listening daily and just allowing yourself to just be led through that faith every day and make those choices. I don't think we can hear that enough. So I think you being on other people's shows and listeners just listening into your show with the world that we live in, the noisy world we live in, just dropping those little reminders as much as we can is super helpful. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show and to meet you in person. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Any last words before we wrap up?
Absolutely. If anybody wants to connect with me about possibly coaching together, I would encourage them to take quick action because the next program is opening soon and I'd love to get them in there if that's something that will work for their lifestyle. But they can go to Java with Jen, just one N, javawithjenpodcast.org, and that'll take you to a book a call page so that you can book a call with me and we can figure out what's going to be the best fit for them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. Thanks for being on the show. Thank you for everyone for joining.